Great. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm coming from Toronto, Canada. I'm a health policy and health services researcher and work with one of Ontario's health technology assessment groups that generates evidence relevant to this. So I think I hope I'm speaking to one of the key workshop objectives, which is to think about innovative hearing technologies and their role in healthy aging, and explore barriers to their development and use. And health technology assessment is a very, very important tool. It is both a barrier, and the drug industry commonly talks about health technology assessment as the fourth hurdle. After getting through a phase 1 clinical trial, a phase 2 clinical trial, a phase 2, then a phase 3 clinical trial, the health technology assessment would be a fourth hurdle. It is also a very, very important facilitator, both with respect to development and use. So HTA, and I'll go into this in some detail, is really a field of applied policy analysis. It's developed and designed to support decisions about payment for health technologies. And when I use that term, I'm talking about drugs, devices, diagnostics, and a range of procedures. And agencies vary in their scope, but they will often look at public health interventions, such as health promotion, different ways of organizing healthcare, as well as high-tech and low-tech technologies. It's an evidence-informed and a value-laden enterprise that, as I say, plays an important and growing role in determining what kinds of technologies and services will be available for patients within healthcare systems, and is increasingly being thought about and organized to support technology development, to acknowledge its role within innovation systems, and to think about how it can more proactively function with respect to development. So let me take up these two issues. Before I do that, though, I feel I have to address a couple of assumptions here where perhaps you're thinking, okay, you're from Canada, you're from a single-payer system, everything you're talking about has got nothing to do with what we're dealing with here. So let me start with that one, which is, good heavens, one of Canada's premier health economists, Bob Evans, this is a favorite of my quote from him: in modern healthcare systems, people pay for the care of other people, not for their own. Which is to say that for the most part, we behave as users of healthcare in a very different way than we behave as users of most of the other services that we get access to, whether it be plane tickets or toothpaste or any number of things. Healthcare is primarily financed through payments, is primarily not financed, through payments by the users for the episodes of care that they use. It is primarily financed, in fact, through collective payment mechanisms, insurance systems, public or private. And again, and the US is no exception to this. But in fact, if you look at the data on this, one way of thinking about this question of who's paying for the direct consumption of your health care is to ask what proportion of the total spend is coming out of people's pockets in the way that you pay for your plane tickets or your toothpaste. And in fact, across OECD countries, there's a general trend to a reduction in out-of-pocket expenditures, including in the States. Now, this isn't 2013 data or 14, but the US has for a number of years been less than Canada, actually, as a percentage of the total spend that's coming out of people's pockets. So in this country, as well as in single-payer systems like Canada's healthcare systems and other European countries and most of the industrialized countries, where it's a public taxpayer-funded or Social Security sort of state-mandated system, and of course you're moving somewhat towards that, the vast majority of your health care is provided collectively. We pay for each other's care, not so much for our own. Now, the other point you'd be thinking is, okay, that's great, but we're talking about primarily, though not exclusively, hearing aids and other hearing-related technologies. And of course, the coverage of hearing aids is quite variable. There is partial subsidy in my own province. So two of Canada's biggest provinces do provide some substantial coverage of the technologies. And of course, the medical services, the healthcare services, that would help in the screening and in the provision of care. And it's obviously more developed in Europe and very limited, I understand, in the US. However, I think part of the point of this workshop is very much to focus on healthy aging. That this is about a health policy conversation, a very important health policy conversation, which all countries have to engage in, to ask about how we support healthy aging. And as some of my colleagues in Toronto argue, small things matter in big healthcare systems, by which they mean, if we're talking about healthy aging, it's not the hips and knees so much, or the cardiovascular, the heart surgery, but it is, in fact, support for living at home. It is supportive care for transportation, meals, personal support. These are the types of small things that actually enable people to age healthily. And arguably, hearing aids are one of those technologies and services that are the small things that matter. And this is an image many of you will be familiar with, that as we look at our healthcare systems, it's not so much aging that is the tsunami that's going to overwhelm us. It's the extent to which people age in chronic and debilitating conditions versus healthy. And this is, the triangle is very important, because what it suggests is the vast majority of the population, 70 to 80%, can be sustained, can be supported through self-care, supportive care, low levels of the small things that help people to age healthily. And then you go up the triangle, you need much more expensive, much more intensive interventions until you get to the level 3, which is where all the money is going when it really in healthcare systems. So the point is, I think an important part of the conversation is, where is hearing technology, hearing support technology? Is it an important part of supporting healthy aging and downward substitution, investing in lower cost technologies to avoid sooner investment in higher cost technologies? So I hope I've convinced you that technology assessment is relevant. Let me now talk about it. Let me try and explain how it influences use. Now, first of all, HTA is an American invention, one of many American innovations. The term, I think, was first used in the US Congress in the late 60s. The Office of Technology Assessment, developed in 1972, no longer exists, unfortunately, but really started this organized, multidisciplinary field of policy analysis to say, how do we support decision-making? And the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality in the US is still an important supporter and conductor of health technology assessment. It's very well developed internationally. It continues to grow. So the international network has 57 member agencies in 32 countries. And it exists because, I follow appropriately on the previous speaker, it exists and has been developed because the newly approved does not always mean new and improved. And what regulators look for in determining market access is really some fairly, what from our perspective is pretty basic and fundamental stuff. Is it safe to have on the market, at least for a specific class of patients? Does it work at all? Does it, in theory, do what it claims to do? From the perspective of collective payment, our insurance systems, we are asking more rigorous, that's the fourth hurdle, a higher bar. We're saying, is it safe and at least as good as alternatives in the real world? And is it worthwhile? Not a question as much often asked here, but in many countries, is it worthwhile to invest? So it's a different body of evidence, evidence-laden, and evidence-based and value-laden. So it is this next stage in bringing to bear decision-making. So its role is, that was why it's developed, that's why it exists, that's why it is growing, but it still is not an incredibly established mechanism in the way that the regulatory authorities are. Regulatory authorities exist in all jurisdictions. They have a quite clear role in determining market access. It varies, obviously, between the US FDA and in Europe, where, I'm not sure if you've discussed this, but regulatory requirements for market access for medical devices are much reduced, although there's some effort to up the ante there. But HTA, despite its importance, is a more recent development. And so in some healthcare systems, it's fairly detached from coverage. It's providing guidance, but it's not actually deciding. In other healthcare systems, it is very directly informing the coverage. So some of you will have heard of NICE, the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence in the UK, which as a national agency reviews technologies, says it's a go, and they must be covered. They must be provided. And obviously in Ontario, our HTA agencies work a lot more like that, and across provinces. Canada doesn't have a single healthcare system. We have 13 to depending on who you count, 14, but all of the provinces and territories have their own system. Within each of them, then, HTA often has a fairly close link, a direct link to the decision to buy. And sometimes they're even more complex in their role. They're even more embedded in decision-making. So there's a movement, particularly in Canada and some European countries, to locate health technology assessment within a regional health authority or hospital, where they're actually not just saying, in principle, this would be good to have, but they're saying within this year's budget, this is what we're going to invest in. So it's an even more fraught. So it is a variable role. But nonetheless, there's variations on a menu of the evidence that needs to be looked at. And the first and most important, and the one that determines most of the decision-making, though not all, about whether or not to invest in health technology is clinical evidence. And here, as I said, this is the basic evidence that a regulatory authority would ask for, safety and efficacy. But it is also an emphasis on real-world effectiveness. So while market access typically says, well, with a very carefully selected group of patients, does your technology yield an outcome? From the HTA perspective, we want to know whether the usual group of patients in more real-world conditions actually achieve that outcome. Moreover, in the regulatory context, the question is often, does it work against nothing? Whereas in the HTA context, it is a comparative effectiveness, because there is typically not nothing going on at the moment before this new technology hits the market. So we want to know how it compares to the existing best case scenario, or at least another technology or package of services that's being used. We want to know how it compares. Is it better? So that is what AHRQ, Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality in the US, supports through its evidence centers. Its HTA is focused on clinical evidence. In the US, there has been a tremendous resistance to going the next step, which is common, certainly in Canada, the UK, most of Europe, which is to explicitly tackle the economic evidence question. Because if we're all paying for each other's healthcare services, the question isn't just whether, in principle, this is beneficial, but whether we want to invest in this, given the limited pool of resources that we have, under the assumption that if you bring in these 5 new technologies that cost X, something has to give. So we want some assessment of what we call the opportunity cost. What are we foregoing in order to invest? And so there's many, many different approaches to this in places like Canada, Australia, the UK. It's very much a cost utility with a standard focus on quality adjusted life year and all the evidence that goes around that. Sometimes it's more, as in Germany, more France, more about specifying what price you'd pay to get the value that you want. So that's the basic for this technology. Are we getting an improvement in life and or quality of life that for the cost per unit of improved quality of life? That's the sort of value for money question. But the next is the budget impact, because it may be fabulous value for money, but it's still so wildly expensive, and for so many people it can't be invested in. Nonetheless, this is a big part of HTA. Oh, what just happened to my presentation? I pressed the wrong button. And then finally, because as I said, HTA is a fraught and complex exercise. It's evidence-informed and value-laden. To say that the clinical evidence is, the benefits exceed the burdens, there's a value judgment there. To say that it's worth investing in is clearly a value judgment. And so there's increased effort and interest in getting very explicit about what value judgments we're bringing to bear and whether our value assessment is appropriate. So in part, that's about patient preferences, because it is not always the case that the clinical evidence is looking at a target that really matters to patients. You could have the best quality evidence on outcome A, but outcome B is the thing that really matters. So if you're looking at comparative effectiveness, how do we balance our desire for high quality evidence against our value commitment to serving patients, which is what this is ultimately about. So that's a very important thing, is a juggling around patient preferences and expectations and experiences. The other is health equity, that the value for money decision doesn't tend to ask whether or not this is distributed fairly across the population. It's just a unit of quality improvement. But maybe we need to think about this unit differently if it's supporting healthy aging than if it's supporting some acute intervention elsewhere, or end of life, for example. And finally, there's the larger question of how these agencies conduct themselves, and that's a sort of accountability for reasonableness is a common phrase. So transparency in what they're doing, clarity in the reasons that they're using, consistency in the application of their reasons, and a forum for appeal and review where there seems to be limitations in the way that's been done. So there's a lot of work, and my own work is more focused there on trying to ensure that this, as I say, evidence-based but value-laden exercise meets the expectations of the communities that it seeks to serve. So that's HTA as it has existed, as it continues to exist, and a vast amount of work internationally and in many local groups that continues to, I think, push the envelope and increase its influence in influencing, its influence in deciding what we will provide for each other within healthcare systems. But increasingly, HTA is being asked to think about its role in a technology innovation system. We heard a terrific talk about the technologies that exist and that are coming. What's the role of something like HTA in trying to encourage that? Say, what kind of technologies do we need to address users' needs? What's its role there? And that's, I think this is an image from the UK, Innovation, Health and Wealth, which puts it really nicely. Lots of interesting work in many, many countries that are focusing on this. But to think about innovation in health as a question of health, but also wealth. What is the role of healthcare systems and HTA? So obviously, in innovation policy, there's increased attention within organizations like the Institute of Medicine, the National Academies, not just to the push side, let's fund new research, right, which HTA has really very little to do with, but the demand side. How, in fact, from the perspective of buying innovations, does that demand drive the innovation system? How does demand give the right signals to those who would seek to produce? How does it pull the innovation towards consumers? How do we organize demand? And there's increased attention to that within healthcare systems, that they are drivers of growth or not, as the case may be. So there's a couple, I'm just going to talk about three, what I'd characterize as experiments in health technology assessment that are happening in various places around the world as we think about the role of HTA, not just as a sort of a bar, meet this standard and we will pay for this, we will provide it for our population, but also to recognize that that bar, that barrier, is a way of influencing and pulling innovations towards ultimate users. So the first experiment is just for health technology assessment to pay more attention to the whole adoption question. Because to pay for something is obviously an issue, but it doesn't mean it's going to be used. It doesn't mean it's going to be appropriately used. It doesn't mean that you've altered the way that providers behave in making this service, this technology or service available to consumers. So how do you think about that? And so obviously in places like the UK, there's been a move to bring the adoption question in alongside the assessment question, particularly for medical technologies, to have an analysis of both whether, in theory, we would want this new technology alongside how we would get it used. Because if it's good enough to pay for, then you're trying to get it used equitably and broadly across the appropriate population. So really focusing on that. Also in Ontario, my own jurisdiction, we're behind the UK in this, I think, but working more actively on implementation. It's a very recent report. The second experiment is around harmonization. Health technology assessment and the evidence expectations that it has, how are they harmonized or not with other evidence expectations? So there's two parts of this. One is to say, look, the regulators, they're out there, they're saying we need this evidence. And it's fairly low, as you know, when it comes to hearing aids. Or appropriately low, but it's not a huge evidence requirement, but that's what they're asking for. Are there ways to harmonize or align what HTAs want, the evidence that they ask for, with the evidence that regulators ask for? Would that be easier for developers if they knew it's not the fourth hurdle, but it's part of the first, second, and third hurdle? I think there's all sorts of challenges there, but it's an active area of exploration in Europe, for example, and certainly internationally there's been much discussion about that. The other is in many ways the fact that each HTA agency, unlike the regulators who say, okay, market access to the US, right? That's the decision that they make. Or in Canada, Health Canada, market access to Canada. But HTA says, it says we'll pay for this within Ontario's healthcare system, or within this hospital, or within the Blue Cross Blue Shield system, or within the VA system, or with, right? So obviously the insurers follow each other, and there tends to be, if somebody says yes, if CMS says yes, then others will too. But there isn't consistency across HTA agencies in the evidence they seek, and there's lots of good and bad reasons for that. So lots of interest in that. There's an interesting initiative, Green Park Collaborative, between industry and HTA agencies to work through at least one disease area and say what would be the evidence that HTA agencies would be looking for. And I'm almost done. The third experiment is what people are calling early health technology assessment. So HTA comes after, typically, regulatory review, right? So you have all sorts of industries, particularly small and medium-sized companies, who are thinking regulators. They recognize that, they know that, because that's well known, and they're developing their product with an expectation that there'll be this level of regulatory review. They have no idea, oftentimes, of the influence of health technology assessment bodies, who then have another set of expectations about what evidence needs to be generated. So part of the issue, part of the solution might be to bring the health technology assessment enterprise earlier as sort of decision support for industry, fail fast, fail early if you're going to fail, know sooner if it's going to sell, right? But also, as I was discussing earlier, to think about this intelligence that health technology assessment brings together as sophisticated customers, right? Ways of making decisions for pools of people, bringing that intelligence, that knowledge about what we will pay for each other, or think is appropriate to give to each other earlier in the design and development phase. So in Ontario, we have an interesting initiative called Marsexcite that our research group is heavily involved with, that is trying to be a single portal for evidence review and evidence generation earlier in the design and development phase. And that means we're working with large multinational enterprises, but also small, medium-sized enterprises who really have no idea in the design and development phase what ultimately they're going to need to show to prove that, in our case, in Ontario's healthcare system, will pay for it. And in Ontario, this initiative has actually now brought to the attention of our technology assessment group that decides on what medical technologies specifically to look at. We've never before looked at technologies developed by small and medium-sized enterprise in sort of 15 years of operation. But in the last 2 years with Marsexcite, there's now multiple technologies from the SME sector that are actually going to be looked at for payment within Ontario's system, which is probably one of the, one way to think about Ontario's healthcare system is one of the largest HMOs in North America, because that's kind of what it is. So that's where we are. So in closing, the HTA has a growing and an increasingly demanding role to support evidence-informed and value-laden decisions, and to more actively engage in its role within innovation systems. And I think it can play an important role in analyzing the merits of our collective investments in hearing loss technologies in that downward substitution to support healthy aging, and as a guide and incentive for the further development of technological innovations that are going to support us moving forward. So thanks very much.